Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's audio discussion. We will be discussing the evolving threat of terrorism in some parts of Europe. My name is Sitati Wasilwa. I am an information services manager for Europe, Middle East, and Africa here at Epic Assistance. Joining me for this discussion are my two colleagues who will briefly introduce themselves. Please, you can introduce yourselves and then we can go through the discussion.
Thanks, Sitati. My name is Ramu. I am a senior geopolitical analyst at APAC Assistance. Fatima?
Yes, thanks, Ramu. I'm Fatima Germanwala, and I'm a research and support executive at APAC Assistance.
Thank you very much. So recently we've seen some movements in relation to the threat of terrorism in Europe. And from the outset, at the beginning of this year, specifically on the 4th of January, the Islamic State announced a new global offensive. And later on the 23rd of March, around 145 people were killed in a terrorist attack in Moscow, in Russia, and the Islamic State claimed responsibility for that. So probably starting with you, Ramu, what are some of the other maybe prominent terror-related incidents? You can mention probably two, starting with the announcements which were made, or the threats which were made by the Islamic State in April in relation to attacking some football match venues.
Oh yeah, thanks, Sitati. So yeah, the Islamic State, Khorasan Province, which have been more or less confined to their operations within Afghanistan, is right now, it shifted its focal point towards Europe, and specifically they made the statement in April calling for attacks against major sporting events, that are up and coming in the calendar year in Europe. And the first potent threat was actually given to the UEFA Champions League final, was happening in France. And then now you have the Euro Cup championship between different football championship between different European nations that is going on, and the threat alert has been raised throughout Germany in all the destinations where the matches are actually being held. But most of the speculation is regarding how the Olympics is going to pan out. I mean, because most of the security preparations have been beefed up in the build up to the Olympic Games that are happening in Paris, in France, starting from July 26th. Just as a sideshow to Western Europe, there have been two major terror-related attacks in Russia. And the first one, as Sitati just mentioned, it happened in Moscow in the concert hall. And just recently, I mean, in June last month, there were a series of attacks in the Dagestan region of North Caucasus, which is neighboring the Chechen region of Russia. And if as we might be aware of, the Chechen region was witness to a sort of an insurgency in the 1990s. I mean, especially against the Russian state, the Kremlin, and it was brutally suppressed in a way, and under the strongman Ramzan Kadyrov, who's still considered to be one of Putin's right-hand men. And it remains to be seen why the ISKP affiliated actors targeted Dagestan, which unlike Chechnya, is known to be more stable and more prosperous. But it may be in relation to a spillover effect from what is happening in Gaza with respect to like Israeli military objectives. So a lot of the operatives that actually targeted religious centers, specifically Jewish synagogues in Dagestan, they emerged from former Soviet states, post-Soviet states. That is like the right terminology. from the Central Asian regions, like Central Asian countries like Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and whatnot. So we need to actually establish a link between why they targeted Russia and try to connect it with what is happening in Israel also at the same time. Sitati, do you have any points to offer over here?
Yeah, I mean, in relation to Russia, the recent terrorist attacks, against some Russian territories by the Islamic State, I mean, it's really critical to understand that Russia is involved in, military operations in Syria, and that has been, or that could be a very big factor why some of these attacks are taking place in a few Russian territories. So one can be able to think of this as probably some sort of retaliatory attacks being carried out by the Islamic State against Russian interests. But of course, something much more interesting to bring out at this point is the fact that Russian President Vladimir Putin has constantly blamed Ukraine, for these attacks, alleging that probably Ukraine could be taking advantage of the evolving terrorism situation to perhaps fund or support some of these terrorist groups to target Russian interests. I mean, one could, because the war is still going on, the war between Russia and Ukraine is still going on, one could be tempted to think or look at this as probably propaganda being spread by the Russian president. But of course, you can never rule out the possibilities that maybe even Ukraine could be taking advantage of these to maybe align itself with a few terrorist groups in a bid to carry out attacks. But, there's too much information that can fly around when war is going on. So those dynamics, we can see an evolution of those dynamics, not just stemming from the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and now moving towards the threat of terrorism in Europe. But covering off on Russia, we can also narrow in on France. Ramu, I recall we just mentioned a few minutes ago about the Olympics, which will be held in Paris, starting from the 26th of this month until some date in August, that is next month. So France is obviously a center of focus in this threat of terrorism across Europe. So from Fatima's end, I know you've been tracking these incidents in relation to the ISKP's threats and even the issues to do with the radicalization of minors and teens over the internet. Probably you can maybe brief us more on this as we try to build a proper context around the threat of terrorism in France.
Right. Thanks, Sitati. So, as we can see, the threat in France, there's a high risk of terrorism in France. ISKP has also threatened to target Eiffel Tower, and they gave out a detailed manual on how to carry out lone wolf attack using drones in Paris during the sporting events and targeting Eiffel Tower. And recently, there has been a rise of radicalization of minors in Europe, minors and teens. For example, in May, French authorities arrested an 18-year-old for plotting a target against a spectator attending a soccer game for the upcoming Paris Olympics. And separately in March, 3 teens were arrested in Brussels, similarly for plotting a terrorist attack. So as we can see, these terrorist groups may continue to utilize minors, and they may continue to radicalize them using internet and maybe promote them more to carry out lone wolf attacks. And this could be a major security implication, as it could be a bit challenging for the security forces in Europe to track minors over internet and who are constantly engaging in these social media engagements to pushing them towards radicalization.
Yeah, certainly. Those are very valid concerns which authorities would want to dig into. and attempt to come up with the most viable mitigation measures to curb on the possible radicalization of minors and teens over the internet. But back to some of the implications and probably security measures which we could see authorities across Europe, including in France where the Olympics will be held. I mean, we certainly expect that we are going to have some really detailed recalibration of nationwide security, in terms of enhanced surveillance, probably the deployment of additional counter-terrorism units, and other emergency response strategies being set up by authorities across in Europe. But even what is more interesting at this point for France, you remember towards the end of last year, French authorities elevated the country's risk profile in relation to terrorism. So I don't know what maybe Ramu you have in mind going forward. Definitely, we expect businesses which have operations in Europe to heavily rely on governments for the enhancement of security. But of course, with respect to the fact that the threat of terrorism in Europe is still way too low. I mean, comparatively, when you look at it, when you look at what is happening in most parts of Africa, when you look at what is happening in some parts of the Middle East. But what do you have in mind, I mean, in terms of other additional security measures going forward?
Yeah, like you mentioned, Sitati, when it comes to Europe, so far, the ISKP and their pro-ISIS propaganda media have given out warnings to, like I said, sporting events, and they have even listed out specific venues. I mean, like for example, that they plan to attack the Emirates Stadium in London, the Metropolitano Stadium, and the Santiago Bernabeu Stadium in Madrid, and the Parc des Princes in Paris. So it still remains to be seen how much of this threat is tangible and how much of this threat can translate into direct physical assaults on Western commercial interests. Like for example, the only major linkage that I can actually bring in over here is with regard to the European Union's rather ambivalent stance on the Israeli military actions in Gaza. I mean, their refusal to outright condemn Israeli military actions, and how ISKP or the ISIS, for that matter, can exploit individuals who are expressing solidarity with what is happening in Gaza against Israel to carry out attacks, either through direct indoctrination or through the internet medium, to carry out attacks against these commercial interests that are based in Europe. So that is what I could actually draw a correlation just like that.
And before you move any further, or even before I bring in maybe Fatima to cover off on other additional security measures, I would it will be much more interesting, I mean, for the three of us to try and think around these lines of, for example, what we've seen with the Israel-Palestine conflict. There are campaigns by global multilateral institutions such as the United Nations to go to the extent of calling for European countries to stop supplying, weapons to Israel in its fight against Hamas and whatnot, and even not just the countries, but even Western defense companies. So from that sort of perspective, I believe the reputational risks still for even some of those companies operating in Europe will be massive going forward, given the sustained campaigns against, the supply of weapons by some of the European countries and European companies as well. But of course, we don't really expect the operations in maybe Europe to take a dip or to be massively impacted probably compared to some of the operations, their footprint areas in areas such as the Middle East, where we have different pro-Hamas groups, such as the Houthis in the Red Sea and Yemen and all those areas around there, which could decide to target, these companies by, perceiving them as collaborating with Israel. Anyway, to cut the long story short, I think it's important to, Fatima, if you have any point to raise or bring here in relation to the security measures, what do you think? In terms of intel sharing and governments, how are they likely to react to the changing security environment?
Right. Thanks, Sitati. So, as you have rightly mentioned, security measures will be heightened. Government and travel agency will maintain heightened security advisory for most of the Europe. And this is mainly because the threat of terrorism is coming at a time where a lot of things are happening in Europe. We have these major sporting events, we have elections upcoming, and the rise of far right in Europe is seeing a lot of protests. There have been constant protests and demonstrations, which may continue in the coming weeks, and they may coincide with the sporting events. So there's a lot of things happening, which for which the government will enhance security. Surveillance will be heightened, and intelligence sharings among Europe and its Western allies will be strengthened. And it's also noteworthy that from July 7, Muharram will be beginning, and there is groups such as Islamic State and ISKP have anti-Shia ideologies, and these ideologies may push them to target large gatherings of Shia places of worship in Europe, especially in countries like Germany, France, and UK, where there's considerable Shia populations. So that will be one security concern, but definitely security measures will be heightened as recently there has been no major attack on any Shia places of worship in Europe, but the security will be definitely on height.
Yeah, those are interesting observations, which may not elicit any further debates. But as we close off, definitely for the organizers of the Paris Olympics, probably businesses which operate in France, or even business executives who will be traveling for business-related reasons to Paris, definitely they will have to put up with stringent security measures at the points of entry to the country, airports, especially, and even just generally moving around most of those places in Paris. I don't know if, Ramu, you agree with me on that as we wind up?
Oh, absolutely, Sitati. So yeah, surveillance, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities need to be boosted, not just in terms of what is there as a security apparatus provided by government agencies, but also as individual corporate interests, because France has seen multiple high-profile terrorist attacks over the last decade and a half, and there is a chance that most of the psychological implications, psychological warmongering that is happening, or fear-mongering that is happening, that is being propagated by these terrorist agencies, may even translate into something that can result in collateral damage. So if we are actually factoring in collateral damage, this need not be tactical, targeted, attacks. It can be, targeted at any place where a lot of, damages can occur, or a lot of casualty count can occur. So there is no room for, any kind of a lax approach, or any kind of, laid back nature that way. So security needs to be enhanced at all levels, be it at the government level, be it at individual, company levels also. And and like Fatima mentioned about Muharram, it is very much possible because despite the fact that So far, anti-Shiite attacks have mostly happened in Asia, in South Asia, or Iran for that matter. But we need to, recollect that ISKP started its campaign in 2024 with a major attack in Kerman in Iran. So they have the capability, and they also have the intent to carry out or to transfer this attack to places even within Europe where there is a sizable Shiite population. So yeah, these factors need to be considered going further into the year.
Yeah, certainly very, very interesting points that you have raised there. So at this point, I want to say that businesses which operate, are having operations in across Europe, or which want to venture out in Europe, should not hesitate to reach out to Able Assistance for bespoke and comprehensive risk assessments on the evolving, security environment across Europe, and as well as other parts of the Middle East and African regions as well. So at this point, I want to call it a day, and to our listeners, thank you very much for listening to us. We will get back to you with more audio discussions in the course of the week and other weeks ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.